Okay, so this is uh, Friday's lecture, at least a shortened version of some of Friday's lecture. And so we were looking at the origins of agriculture and theories to explain the origins of agriculture, and we had already looked at Child's oasis theory, where he was saying that people were forced to domesticate agriculture. And that, there really are kind of two categories of theories to explain the origins of agriculture in the Near East. And, you know, one of them, these sort of push models, are that people were forced to do it because of circumstances. And then the other kinds of models, like Braidwood's model of a natural habitat hypothesis, is that people were not forced to domesticate agriculture. They just did it as a result of increasing innovation and human experimentation, right? And those are more sort of pull models. So they're not being pushed to do it, but human innovation is pulling them forward to domesticate plants and animals, right? So what he felt was, as we talked about before, is that he thought humans naturally experimented with certain plants, certain animals, they that they were living next to in the wild, right? So he thought that the earliest agricultural people would have lived in the areas where these wild ancestors of sheep, goat, cattle, pig, barley, wheat, etc., naturally occurred in the Middle East. And the way he tested this is by actually trying to find a site in the Middle East that fit this description to see if he could find an early agricultural village that's in an area today where there are wild wheat, etc. The problem with his idea is that it doesn't explain why it happened at a certain time. Why it happened 8,000 BC to 6,000 BC. So that's one of the problems of his idea. There are other problems as well, but it was a good first step, or a good next step after Child. He was trying to use scientific method and new archaeology in the Middle East. So what he did was he picked a site that fit the description of what he was looking for, and the site turned out to be Jarmo. So he found evidence of very early agriculture. It was in an area of northern Iraq where wild wheat grows today. He found mud houses. Pisé is actually not mud bricks, but mud walls, where it's just the mud piled on top of each other to form walls, but not actually discrete bricks. Each house had its own oven. There were about 30 houses, so it's a population of 150 to 200. Some of the things that he found are in the Oriental Institute Museum, and so we'll see some of the agricultural tools and husking trays and things like that he actually found at Jarmo. He also found lots of agricultural tools, so like we talked about before, hoes, digging sticks, sickles, etc. I found remains of animal bones. Okay. So it was a useful site, but as you can see, it dates to around 7,000 BC, so it's actually not the earliest agricultural village. It actually dates to around the PPNB, not the PPNA, as we're going to see. So the probably Neolithic B. So it's a little bit later than the very earliest agriculture. But again, he made a hypothesis. He went out to test it, and so further archaeologists continued excavations to try to see if his hypothesis was correct or not. Right. But again, it didn't explain why at this time. This is some of the material. This is a model of a house from Jarmo. This is Robert Braidwood, one of the pots he excavated, and also some of the material at the Oriental Institute that's from Jarmo. Okay, so another hypothesis, very similar to the oasis hypothesis, is that as hunters and gatherers became sedentary, the population increased, as sort of one of the things we talked about with sedentism, and then there would be population pressure, too many people for that specific area, and so people would move away. As the area started to fill up, people would be pushed further and further into these sort of less productive areas, these edge zones. This is what Lewis Binford came up with, and because they were living on these edge zones, they would be forced, because of the high population, to develop and domesticate plants and animals, right? And again, this was a good hypothesis, but as you'll see, it doesn't really fit the data that was found in the Middle East. This is kind of a similar situation to, remember we talked about the Kong, hunters and gatherers of the desert in South Africa and Namibia. They became, they reverted to hunting and gathering in desert areas because the productive areas were already taken up, or were quickly taken up by agriculturalists, Bantu-speaking agriculturalists. And so the Kung were pushed sort of to the fringes, these desert margins, right? And so again, the hunting and gathering that we see with the Kung is probably not the same as the hunting and gathering that we see at this time, because their hunting and gathering was forced into extreme areas like the desert by people already settling in these productive areas. But that's sort of what the idea behind this hypothesis, edge zone, right? So the names of the theories, explain what they're dealing with, right? The zone that's at the edge, right? Or the natural habitat hypothesis, the natural habitat of plants and animals, the oasis theory, right? You think of an oasis in the desert. You live in the oasis, you can't move outside the oasis, right? So a lot of these, at least the names of the theories, hopefully will help you remember what they're about, or at least can help you figure out what they're about. Okay. Again, with the evidence really doesn't fit what was found in the Middle East. So the edge zone hypothesis really doesn't explain what was going on. And there's another pull model, you might say, and that's this sort of prestige model, where again it was internal cultural dynamics that were pushing people to domesticate plants and animals. And the idea is not to feed a growing population or necessity, but it came out of a big man-like society where they were trying to produce surplus food because it was part of feasting. It was part of the sort of ambition of certain individuals who wanted to be big men, who needed to generate surplus food for their feasts, which are similar to the potlatches of the Northwest Coast. So if you've taken Cultural Anthropology 204, you probably have learned about these big men societies, right? And the way big men societies work in especially the South Pacific. So here's Samoa. Here's a Samoan big man. And he is pretty big. And here is a big man, in Papua New Guinea. You probably have seen this movie, Unca's Big Mocha, right? But it's about a guy in New Guinea who wants to be a big man, is trying to throw a mocha, or which is a big feast, right? And so he's trying to get his kin to generate surplus, right? But the big thing about these tribe societies or big men societies is that the power of the big man comes from giving and distributing things at feasts. That creates obligations, that creates indebtedness to him, and he can use that to basically be more important, maybe even a little bit more powerful, but he doesn't have any absolute power. It's just sort of power from influence, power from begging, power from calling upon favors, that kind of power. It's not permanent power at all, right? So maybe these early big men who were settled down, collecting wild foods, maybe there was a real incentive to start generating more, and that led to agriculture, right? And that's an interesting theory, but again, that kind of part of it is very hard to prove. Okay, so, well, because of all the archaeological work that has taken place, especially in the Levant, Jordan, Israel, etc., Syria, we have a good idea of how origins of agriculture actually took place in the Near East, right? And we can sort of see step by step from the end of the Ice Age all the way up to the full domestication of animals. We can see steps along the way in the process. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the Natufian. Remember the Natufian peoples? They started out as mobile hunters and gatherers. The climate was very, very good. They didn't have to move around as much. They eventually settled and became sedentary hunters and gatherers. Right? During that time period, the climate started to dry out again, right? So from about 9,000 BC to 8,300 BC, the climate became colder and drier, right? And as you'd expect, if the population is continuing to increase, and then the amount of food is either staying the same or actually decreasing, you reach a point where the population is bigger than the amount of food available in the wild, and that produces a crisis, right? And so what did people do? Well, people had, as we talked a little bit before, they really had two options. They either could go back to being mobile, or they could do something else. And we'll talk about what that something else is. Right? So in areas that were more desert-like, they actually went back to being mobile hunters and gatherers. Right? In areas that were a little bit better and well-watered, right? And this is kind of what we're assuming, that they probably saw, okay, this stand of wheat and barley used to be much more plentiful. Now there's less of it. And they started to take an active role in cultivating and keeping these plants growing. So they might have said, okay, well, let's bring water to this area and water the wheat and barley ourselves. Or let's bring some of the wheat and barley seeds and plant those seeds over closer to the river where they haven't grown naturally before, but we're going to plant them there. And so we're going to try to increase the amount of food that's being produced. Well, that is the beginnings of the domestication of plants, because as they started to pick out and select the seeds that they were going to plant, they probably noticed that some seeds were better than others. Some seeds might have been bigger. Some plants might have had more desirable characteristics. And so they said to themselves, well, let's plant these seeds, right? It's a better plant. That kind of selection over time eventually resulted in domestication. And what do we mean by domestication? Right? Domestication is removing natural selection and substituting human selection, right? And ending up with completely different kinds of animals and plants, and sometimes even producing new species, right, that are different, so completely different genetically from their wild ancestors, right? And so the kinds of characteristics that human beings select for in a population are sometimes the opposite of what natural selection would select for in plants and animals, right? So to give you an idea, this is a kind of sheep in Turkey. It's called a fat-tailed sheep, right? So you can see humans selected for sheep that would produce larger and fatter tails. And in some areas of the world, they got so extreme, right? You can see here in Ethiopia, right? This fat tail actually is so fat it would drag along the ground, so they have to build this little cart for the sheep behind it, right? Well, there's an obvious problem here. How are the sheep supposed to mate if there's this tail, this big heavy tail that's covering the genitalia, right? Well, how do they reproduce? Humans have to help, so someone has to lift up this tail in order for reproduction to take place, right? So if you release these animals in the wild, they cannot reproduce on their own. They have become completely dependent on human beings because of selection. And we see similar things with dogs, right? So if you look at a wolf and you compare it to some of the breeds of dogs today, you can see there are a lot of differences. Physical differences, behavioral differences. So, a wolf, right? When you're looking at size and intelligence and aggression in the wild, for the most part, the larger you are, the more aggressive you are, and the more intelligent you are, the more likely you are to survive. And that's what natural selection would select for. With humans, you actually would want maybe something that's smaller because it's easier to control. You might want an animal that's less intelligent, right? Because it might be more obedient to a human being. And you might want an animal that's less aggressive. So again, it's not going to bite you or bite other members of the community, and it's going to be more obedient, right? And so the human selection has produced very different kinds of characteristics than wild selection. You can also see the differences here in facial features, right? I mean, in wild animals, right, you have smaller eyes, a larger snout, and large ears. And in many of these dogs, you have large eyes, smaller snout, and smaller ears, right? These features that we would consider to be cute, which are basically mimicking childlike features or infantile features, right, appears cuter to us. And that might have been part of the selection process as well. Again, because of human selection, we have produced less intelligent animals, right? So this is from an article from Turkey, right? These sheep, again, domesticated sheep, have been bred to be so less intelligent than their wild ancestors that there was a case where a sheep in the flock fell off a cliff. All these other sheep were following it. What ended up happening is 450 sheep jumping to their deaths in Turkey, right? Because we have bred them to be so less intelligent that they cannot really survive well on their own. The way that people usually prevent this kind of thing is to have goats mixed in with the sheep, because goats are still pretty intelligent, so they prevent sheep from doing something stupid like this. Okay, so these are some versions of versions of barley, right? So here we have barley here and barley here. Not surprisingly, this is the domesticated version of barley. This is the wild version of barley. And you can see larger seeds, more seeds, but there are other changes as well. So again, human selection over time, right? Each planting cycle, selecting for the best traits for humans, produced plants with larger seeds, more seeds, and also different other kinds of traits, right? A trait that's known as the rachis. These are the attachment of the seeds to the stalk. That's a rachis. Human beings selected for a tough rachis, right? Wild barley and wheat usually has a brittle rachis. Why did they select for tough rachis, right? Well, naturally, what's supposed to happen in the wild, and this is, gives you an idea of what one of these agricultural villages might have looked like. But as the wind goes through this wild barley, wild wheat field, the wind picks up the seeds, right? They break off from the stem, they get carried by the wind over someplace else where they are planted. When human beings are harvesting wheat, they don't want these seeds to break off and fall to the ground. They want them to stay on the stalk. So they selected for a tough rachis, so it would be easier to harvest these cereals, right? Other ways you can recognize plant domestication are if the plants are found outside of the natural habitat that they usually grow in. Okay, so what plants were domesticated? Well, as we're going to see, barley and wheat were one of the two most important crops that were domesticated. Barley people ended up producing two varieties, not just 2-row barley, but 6-row barley, right? So one plant, 6 rows of seeds, and different kinds of wheat as well. As we're going to see, barley is an important crop because barley is more heat and salt resistant than wheat, so it's a little bit more of a hardier plant. Chickpeas, lentils, peas, and something called vetch. These were also domesticated around this time, right? So this is the end of the Natufian and in the PPNA, as we're going to talk about, the pre-Pottery Neolithic A period that starts at 8300 BC, the end result of that cold, dry snap, which people took an active role in growing these plants. The end result in that period was the domestication of these plants. Right? Also, by eating some of the legumes with the wheat, you are getting a nutritional balance, right? So the legumes have different kinds of proteins that are not found in the cereal grains, and so they balance out each other, right? So having hummus made out of chickpeas with your pita bread, right, is a good idea because they balance each other out in terms of nutritional aspects. Okay, and also they are, as we said, there's different environments that they grow best in. So a lot of times what we see in the Near East is, and we'll see this in Mesopotamia, is they start growing wheat and barley. At a certain point, they could only grow barley because there's too much salt in the soil or it's too hot. Okay. An archaeologist did an experiment with wild einkorn wheat in Turkey, and went out and collected it with primitive tools. You can see a stone sickle blade. And what he found is that a family of 4 in 3 weeks, right, if everything was good, could harvest a ton of wild wheat, which would be enough to feed themselves for perhaps the entire year. Right? So if things were plentiful, they could go out intensively collect things, and there would be enough food to survive. Problem was, during that cold snap, is that there wasn't enough in the wild, and so people had to start to grow these foods themselves. Okay, so once they domesticate these plants, right, they then start to move these plants to other areas, like we said, where they may not grow necessarily in the wild. And because they are selecting for certain traits, again, these domesticated versions may not have survived well on their own in the wild without human intervention. This can be said of the date palm, which becomes domesticated. The pollen is not released by itself. They can't pollinate each other. Human beings have to do that. Okay, so human beings selected for a tough rachis. Right? They were able to remove seeds and remove the outer shell of the seeds. They were able to even produce some barley that didn't have a very tough outer shell on the seeds, so it made it easier to eat. And they also developed plants that had more seeds and more rows of seeds on the plant. So this is part 1, and we'll continue in part 2.